We have a quick agenda, intense agenda today. I want to go through a series of questions that were asked to me online, but I think they reflect some questions of today's issues relating to genocide. And then I want to talk a little bit about Rwanda and Armenia, the Armenian genocide and Rwanda genocide, and highlight a couple of things. And then I'm going to introduce to you Jill Hoyt, who is with Jewish World Watch, which is a visionary organization started several years ago by the late Rabbi Harold Schulweis, with the idea that Jews have a responsibility to warn the world of genocide and to take action with regard to genocide. And I think it's something that we should be aware of, and indeed something worthy of our support. I was asked by one participant in the course, and because it wasn't said in the chat, I'm going to not mention the person's name because it's not in that sense public, but a whole range of questions are being asked, and I think that it's important that we answer them. Is the finding of question number one, is the finding by the International Court of Justice systematic rape till pregnancy by Serbian forces, including the VRS and the Serbian paramilitary, of Bosniak females was a crime of war rather than a policy of genocidal rape in the context of ethnic cleansing against Bosnian Muslim group, because it would have required intervention to prevent? The answer is, I really don't quite know. Let's all conclude that rape is a crime. How to classify that crime is a different matter. And since it is a judicial finding, I don't have sufficient information to take issue with the judicial finding. I just want to say that rape is not an acceptable action. It's not the rewards of the fighters, though in many different circumstances, it is a tool that is used to violate women and to assert conquest. It is less a matter of sex than is a matter of power, and should be condemned in all occasions without bothering. The condemnation should not differentiate between genocide and a crime of war. There is the crime of rape, and the context becomes important. First, come on population growth in Palestine, which is cited from 1948 to 24. Note the population in Germany and the Weimar Republic was consistently in excess of 500,000 from the census of 25 to the start of 33, indicating that the plan of genocide only evolved and it was executed after that date by the Nazi Party when circumstances enabled them to enact the process. What is the population growth of Palestinians in Gaza in 2024? And is this based on a birth or survival past mortality? I don't know the answer of what the 2024 statistics are. We're in the middle of 2024, and you're a little bit incorrect in the sense that the Jewish population of Germany decreased not insignificantly in the years leading up to 1933, with mass migration beginning earlier and people seeking a haven. And it obviously intensified once Hitler assumed power, and it became acute through the years 33 through 38, and then enormously intense in 38, 39. And the issue was not whether people wanted to leave. The issue was more after 1938, after the Reichspogrom, where they wanted to go. So I accept the fact that if I'm speaking about past genocide, the population increase is evidence. if I'm speaking as to whether Israel is currently committing a genocide or not. The question of population, we don't yet know, and B, we don't have the figures, and B, what I said would not be evidence. Under Article 2, Act of C of the Convention, genocide. Genocide means act of deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the group's physical destruction, whole or in part, as evidence of life in the Warsaw Ghetto. How is this situation in Gaza different than this? Well, the situation in Gaza, we can say, first of all, I don't want to get distracted from genocide to go into Gaza. I've been speaking a good deal on the Middle East and the situation, and not on critically of in any respect. But let me just answer that very specifically. There is number one, aid has been delivered, inadequate, insufficient, and also not only has aid been delivered, but aid has not been distributed within Gaza. And part of that is because, in fact, there is no strategy for who is to be in control of Gaza. And that's one of the weaknesses of both the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the international community, and also the capturing of such aid. We do have counter testimony to genocide and the fact that you have currently going on, with all of its problematics, the inoculation of 640,000 youngsters against polio, which means that even throughout, and this is based on a mistake that the international medical community made several years ago in not inoculating properly against polio, because there's no way that 640,000 Palestinian children should not have been inoculated against polio in pre-October 7th time. They were given the wrong inoculation, is the way I understand it, and consequently, Israel is permitting and the UN is administering a massive inoculation of 640,000 people. There was an attack yesterday. Israel's claim on that attack is that even in the humanitarian corridor, with the cessation of hostilities for a recognized period of time, there was, in essence, the movement of what they deemed Hamas fighters. I'm in no position either to verify or to criticize and the like. 4 is the killing of civilian ethnic population in Gaza in excess of 10,000, despite Article 2 of the Convention on Genocide. Killing members of the group considered possibly of mental harm to members of the group in whole or in part in time peace war be considered political damage or an inadvertent genocide. We don't know. The reality is that it's tragic damage. I think collateral damage is a horrific term. It's tragic damage. It is painful damage. It is excruciating damage. I don't believe it's an inadvertent genocide. I also believe there's significant evidence that leaflets have been dropped, calls have been made, and attempts have been done, whether adequate or inadequate. I'll leave others to judge. I'm not on the ground at that point. To alleviate the loss of civilian life when attacks are made. This is a very unusual thing that has been done in a time of war. Number 5, Articles of the Convention, crime, genocide, collective punishment, considered a war crime, if not genocide. There is an ultimate question that will have to be engaged by the international community at this point in time, and that is whether a just war can be fought justly in conditions in which the civilians are, the military is embedded within the civilian population, which is in and of itself, when they're embedded in schools, mosques, and hospitals, considered a war crime. but that is not something I can fully judge at this point. I am interviewing the leading authority now in his late 80s, if not approaching 90, and that is Michael Walzer, on precisely whether the question of just crime has been engaged, whether just war has been engaged, and whether just war can be fought under these conditions. Israel, and this is a context which is important, Israel is responding to an attack of October 7th on its civilian population. Again, the question becomes whether they are regarded by Hamas as a civilian population, but youngsters in concert and civilian settlements, homes, and villages in international kibbutzim in internationally recognized territory belonging to the state of Israel. Number 6 has the system of apartheid. Palestinians, West Bank, and Gaza are held under military law. Is the state of Israel encouraged the dehumanization articulated by Israeli politicians? I would say we can debate whether apartheid is the correct number. I would say that Israeli politicians have been, especially Israeli politicians belonging to the settler community, have been linguistically and in other means possible dehumanizing the Palestinian population. Thus, the classification of population Gaza as Palestinians classification allowed for the ambiguous representation of civilian population as a Muslim terrorist them. The answer is that Israel has been trying, but not all political leaders, not all civic leaders have been successful in differentiating between its war on Hamas and its war against and its non-war against the Palestinian population. There are those within Israel who believe that all Palestinians are potentially adversaries and the like, but Israel has been clear systematically that it is at war with Hamas. It's been quite consistent in using that linguistically. That is not to say, and that's an important concept, and that's not to say also that some leaders have not blurred the distinction, if not completely obliterated the distinction. It's clear in Gaza of Hamas a means to cloak intention as a preparation. I think we can say the following, which deals with it. Israel has the capacity to commit genocide, namely overwhelming force. It has the excuse to commit genocide, namely it was attacked, it continues to be attacked by rockets that were set and by an invasion of Hamas forces on the 7th of October, the killing of civilians. It has restrained and not engaged in the wholesale systematic elimination of the Palestinian population. It's tried to distinguish between the Palestinians and Hamas. How's long-standing separation, confiscation of familial abode, Palestinian group in the West Bank not a feature of persecution? There is no question that there are those within Israel and who act without restraint, who would seek to persecute the Palestinians, and in addition to which there are restraints on that persecution and legal rights established by the Supreme Court and opposition to the Supreme Court precisely because of that. Is the collateral damage of 38,000 civilian deaths a legal fiction? Let me begin by saying that the 38,000, number one, I don't trust the figures on either side, and that is that the figures offered by the Israelis is the number of Hamas militants who were killed, I'm not sure is any way accurate. I'm also not sure whether indeed the figure of 38,000, which includes at that point, it's now over 40,000, which includes Hamas fighters, is an accurate figure either. But having said that, if indeed the both figures were correct and the ratio of is 2 to 1 in terms of fighters to civilians, or 1 to 2 in terms of fighters to civilians, I hate to say this, I'm ashamed to say this, I'm embarrassed to say this as a human being, but that is not a in terms of military damage, that's not a ratio that that's a ratio that compares to other ratios in quite in I don't want to say good fashion, but compares favorably to other ratios of numbers killed regarding civilians and fighters, especially given the circumstances in which the fighters find themselves. The state of Israel is signatory to the Geneva Convention. Yes. If the Trail of Tears is an instance of inadvertent genocide, how is tampering with Medicare to the mortality of both mother and infant not imposing measures intended to prevent birth? Again, one of the problems in the entire situation, which is catastrophic, terrible, et cetera, one of the terrible things is that hospitals have been used and tunnels have been built under hospitals, and hospitals have been used as a source of weapons, and consequently the nature of the attacks on hospitals when they have been there is again not quite the same thing if they were not being used for weapons. Let me see if I've answered all of these questions. Is the organized military response by the state of Israel and Gaza collateral damage? Again, the organized response of Israel is an act of war against Hamas. And it's a war that Israel did not seek and did not invite. It is a war in response to what happened and the attacks of October 7th. Let's remember one thing. On October 6th, there was a ceasefire, and it is clear which side broke the ceasefire and for what purposes. And Israel suffered the greatest damage, the greatest loss of Jewish population since 1945, and had every right under the terms of self-defense to take action against Hamas, and that's what it did. So is it collateral damage? No, it is an act of a direct attack of war. Israel declared in that sense war at that point and has been at war with Hamas. Notice again, they're saying with Hamas and not with the Palestinians. So I think that's answered all of those questions, but I think we have to grapple with these questions and deal with them. Let me now turn to a couple of elements, and we're going to we've used more time for questions than I want. Let me turn to a couple of elements with regard to the Armenian genocide and also the genocide in Rwanda. I want to focus on Rwanda for a moment because, again, let me give you the broadest of outlines of Rwanda because we won't have enough time to go through with it, but I want to focus on two very unique aspects of what happened in Rwanda. For those of you who want to get comfortable with the vocabulary, there were two major groups, actually three groups in Rwanda: the Hutu, the Tutsi, and the Twa. These three groups speak the same languages, but they are distinct. The Twa are less than 1% of the population. The Hutu are 4/5 of the population, and the remainder are Tutsi. There were social differences between Hutu and Tutsi. They were profound, as shown by the system of patron-client ties. The Tutsi had a strong pastoral tradition. They gained social and economic ascendancy through, they gained social and economic ascendancy. There are physical differences between them, and that is that the Tutsi, they could be seen by their physical appearances, by height, by whether one was light-skinned and tall, and the Hutu were dark-skinned and short. There's one pivotal element of this, which is the colonial powers. And colonial powers were Germany until 1916 and Belgium beyond 1916. The colonial powers exploited the ethnic differences within Rwanda, and they exploited them in order to, as it were, divide and control and conquer. And they used that. And the other very significant thing that turns out to be all important at a later point is that they gave people identification cards that declared whether they were Hutu or Tutsi. Worst and equally important is they presumed that the division between Hutu and Tutsi was a virtually absolute division, when in fact there was a significant merging of the population, including intermarriage of the population, and people of mixed tradition of Hutu and a Tutsi background, which later becomes important because since ethnic identity was on the part of the father, very different than Judaism, where it's on the part of the mother, since ethnic identity was on the part of the father, we had a unique situation in which some of the murderers and some of the executions were done against people whom in Western tradition we would define as nephews and nieces, and as blood relationship, as it were, with regard to that. The relationship between the Tutu and the Tutsi and Hutu was not peaceful, to say the least. And one of the elements that was very important is in between 59 and 61, some 20,000 Tutsi were killed and many fled the country. This fleeing of the country becomes very important because their children, their sons in particular, came back into the country to fight against the genocide. And the equivalent in the American experience, or in the experience on the American continent, would be as if the sons of the exiles from Cuba came in to fight a fight in Cuba against another ethnic group. 61 was precisely the time when you had the major Cuban refugees, and they came back in a very real respect with regard to fighting the Hutu in 1994. What was the precipitating event? And this is where preparation becomes important. On April 6, 1994, a plane carrying the president of Rwanda and the president of Burundi was shot down over Kigali. Kigali is the capital of Rwanda. We do not know to this day who was responsible for the shooting down of that. But you immediately then had, and this is where preparation comes into play, you immediately had, and the president of Rwanda was considered in retrospect relatively moderate, meaning that he wanted to maintain a certain type of status quo and balance between the ethnic groups in society and not go to the extreme. That was not true of his wife. And a group of radicals took hold, and immediately when they came in, the first casualty was the prime minister of Rwanda, who herself was considered a moderate. And then over the next 100 days, and 100 days is a metaphorical term because it may have been 106, it may have been 94, considering on which element you take place. There was the wholesale systematic slaughter of Tutsis within Rwanda, men, women, and children. And the modality of slaughter becomes terribly important for us to understand because the modality of slaughter was essentially a machete. And when you think of a machete, you have to think of how deeply and profoundly personal that killing is, because you have to stand within arm's length of your victim. You have to essentially swing the machete and cut off their head. I'm sorry to be graphic, but if you're studying genocide, you have to be, in that sense, graphic. And that meant that essentially, if you think of the Nazi killing as a different element, the Nazi killing tried as much as possible to depersonalize the killing process. I can show you a map of how to kill, even by the Ansatz group in the mobile killing units. The mobile killing units operated in a particular way, which is they had the victims normally dig a mass grave in a valley in a wadi. They stood at a distance. They used the propelling of the bullets to force the person into the mass, force the person who had been killed into the mass grave. They then covered it up, and they stood at a distance from those to be killed, and they tried to depersonalize the process. That became difficult for the killers, and what becomes true in the Holocaust is that it became further depersonalized, as many of you have heard me say, because the second stage of killing was not the Holocaust by bullets, even though that took more than 2 million lives. The second stage was, if you cannot send mobile killers to stationary victims, you make the victims mobile, and the killing centers a stationary process, and essentially you reverse it and depersonalize it so that a minimum number of people were involved in the killing. And in Rwanda, you had a personalized killing of people who stood within arm's length. Now, what I want to get to, which is, again, unique about Rwanda, are three elements. Number one, the United Nations had troops there. The United Nations troops, whose formal responsibilities were to keep the peace between ethnic groups, did not intervene. And one of the most eloquent testimonies is by the United Nations commander, who speaks about receiving the order to keep his troops at base. His troops were well armed and seemingly well trained. And at that point, they did not intervene, even though they were present. And again, intervention is not against a massive army that was exceedingly well equipped with rockets, with grenades, with machine guns. It's against a group of marauding killers, for the most part, who are operating in the most primitive way with machetes in terms of the killing process. The second element that becomes terribly important is the United States sent troops in, sent Marines in to what? Not to oppose the genocide, but sent Marines in to essentially rescue Americans who were in a situation of acute danger. So the Marine assignment, and this occurred after the debacle that happened in Somalia, when, and those of you who have seen Black Hawk Down understand it, when American troops were paraded after American troops had intervened to prevent a famine that would have taken multiple lives. American troops intervened, and the American troops were victimized and slaughtered, and Bill Clinton was reluctant to intervene here. So American troops came in, but American troops only rescued Americans and offered them the option of leaving. I want to tell a personal story, and I was, by the way, in Rwanda after the genocide as one of the advisors to the government on how to document the crime and bury the bodies, because when I went to Rwanda, the massive graves were open. I had one of my most important moments as a teacher in Rwanda. As I came to the hotel we were staying in, a woman walked up to me and hugged me and said, "I'm here because of you." I looked at her and didn't quite understand who she was. And then she referenced the fact that she had been in my class in 1984 at Georgetown University. What was remarkable in 1984 is we had I had made my students, when they studied the Holocaust, adopt the tapes of survivors. In those days, it was still tapes, and relate to whatever we were teaching in the course. They would relate it to the experience of their survivor. And a young lady comes in and says, "I'd like to tell my story." And I asked her, "Tell me what your story is." And it turned out she was a survivor of the Cambodian genocide who had come to the United States, and 4 years later was a student at Georgetown University. She told her story. And as I said, of that semester, the curriculum went out the window, but my students got a real education. The woman who greeted me in Rwanda was a student in that class. 10 years later, she had become a doctor. She was with Doctors Without Borders. And she said, I asked myself, what should I do? Should I leave with the Americans? And I said, what did I learn from that class? I learned to stay. And now I have a favor to ask of you. And I said, whatever it is, I will do. Go tell my parents why I stayed, because they're furious at me because I didn't use the opportunity to leave, and I put myself in danger. But I understood that I had to be there and continue to work, because if we don't fight genocide, then we contribute to genocide. So the elements that were pivotal is that the United Nations was there. It knew what was happening. It sent word back to headquarters. There is a fax, which is, you have orders to stay to base. American troops were there, but only to rescue Americans, not to stop the genocide. And then the only way the genocide was halted was by military intervention by the people who had the Tutsi who had originally been exiled in 1959 to 61, who had been brought up in the Congo, who came in and began to militarily oppose with minimum forces and minimum training, militarily oppose the um, the forces that were committing genocide on the Hutu side. Let me just spur forward for a moment. The Nuremberg precedent was invoked at two levels, namely there were trials of leadership, and then there were trials of non-leadership participation in the genocide in Rwanda. One was an international trial. One group was tried internationally. The other group was tried within the country itself. And that clearly is the Nuremberg precedent. And finally, the last element I want to talk about is that there is a strong element of memorialization that has taken place within Rwanda. And that is that there is a significant museum in Kigali to the genocide, which tells a truthful and painful story. And great efforts were made in 1995, after the genocide had ended, to find a way to document the crime so that denial would not set in. I'm going to limit that here for a couple of minutes. I'm going to invite our guest, Jill Hoyt of Jewish World Watch, to step in and tell you a bit about her work and a bit about what is happening in the contemporary world on genocide. And I'll come back in very briefly a little bit later. If we have time, we'll touch on the Armenian genocide, and I'll want to mention a couple of things about that in passing when I come back, and then we'll take your questions. And unfortunately, that's all the time we'll have for this class. Jill, take it away, and I'll allow you to introduce yourself as well. And thank you very much for being with us.
Michael, thank you for doing this in general, and thank you for having me. It is deeply appreciated, and I will be short because I'm sure people want to get what was advertised, which is you. And I will simply share the work of Jewish World Watch, for those of you that don't know it, but just to give you a sense of what we're doing and give you maybe even something to do about genocide that's taking place in contemporary society and ways that we can all feel like maybe we're doing something and help preventing it. So Jewish World Watch was created in the aftermath, actually, of Rwanda by Rabbi Harold Schulweis and Janice Kaminer-Resnick, a well-known leader in the Los Angeles Jewish community, and they are the two co-founders. And the way that they saw this happened after a lecture that Harold Schulweis gave at Valley Beth Shalom, where he was just truly upset that we can't let another genocide happen not on our watch. And in a post-Rwanda genocide world, and when we saw what was happening in Sudan then, back in 2004, it's happening again now, they decided to take action. Janice picked up the call for leadership and created Jewish World Watch, which was an expression of Judaism in action. You know, given our history, given our lived reality as Jews, how can we bring help and healing to survivors of mass atrocities, genocides around the globe, inspire people of all faiths, not just the Jewish faith, to come together and fight against genocides that are happening all over the world, make sure people are aware of them. So our work is really about education, advocacy, and through empowerment grants on the ground with partners. So that's the work that we do. And we have really been focused on, it started in Sudan, then went into things that were happening in the Congo, both of which in Sudan and Congo have reignited tremendous violence. We can call it what you like, and I'm not going to use terminology here. You can call it genocide, you can call it mass atrocity, but it's horrific and horrible, and it has become inflamed again over the last 2 years, both in Sudan and in the Democratic Republic of Congo, not to mention other areas that we work in with the Rohingya population, who are now mostly have flown to Bangladesh, and they're living in the world's largest refugee camps, and to the Uyghur population that have been persecuted by the Chinese for many, many, many years. And we've done work on legislation and action in that area, including a database that we now keep up on trying to ensure that companies know that the products that they are using are not created by forced labor. It's the Uyghur Forced Labor Database. It's on our website. I'll tell you more about that later. And those are the kinds of things that we are involved in, making sure people are aware, making sure young people are aware. We have a whole active department developing curriculum that goes into both high schools and on the college campus. And then we put out action alerts and work on getting legislation passed. So that's our work at Jewish World Watch. I can tell you that we have an action alert going out actually today. I'm going to share the link with everybody because I think it's really important that everybody know that there has been renewed violence in Sudan, and really just this last week has peaked. For those of you that don't know, the conflict's already killed up to 150,000 people, displaced about 10 million during this last year. 10 million people. It's the largest displacement in the world. Including 1.8 million people that have flown to neighboring countries, including Chad, where Jewish World Watch is very involved in helping deal with the feeding, care, mental, physical, and otherwise in those refugee camps. There was a very large story, I'm thinking it was 2 days ago, maybe 3 days ago, in the Washington Post. For those of you that didn't see it, again, I'm going to put a link in. It's about an action alert asking the president and asking our representatives to really take action and ensure that we can increase humanitarian support from the United States, ensure accountability for the atrocities, and strengthen the arms embargo, which we're really desperately trying to do. So our work is really one of trying to get people to take action to some of these horrific things that Mikkel has been explaining. For those of you that want to get involved, we would be happy to have your involvement on some of these things. This is something that we do day in, day out. We really deeply care about things that are happening in the world where people are suffering. And the other thing I want to point out is, while I'm mentioning things that are not about Israel and Gaza and the terrible things that are happening in both Israel and Gaza to innocent civilians and the horribleness of whatever war does create, what I want to say is that one of the things that we really truly believe in is that it's a both-and situation. Not only as Jews is it our moral obligation and our Jewish obligation to take care of ourselves, but it can't just be only about us. It's also about the rest. So it's both and that's the message that we are going with, especially during this high holiday season. We think it's our job to not be complacent, to care for ourselves, but also to remember that we live in the context of a bigger world, and it's our responsibility to point that out and to take action and to not stand idly by. Those are some of the big things that we really dearly care about. I'm happy to answer some questions. I am going to take this, I'm going to open this up. I'm just trying to see if I can put this in. Can I share it in the chat, Michael?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so in the chat, I'm just putting in our action alert. So if anyone clicks on that, you'll see what the action alert says. It's a letter to the president and our local elected officials. You can sign it. It goes directly to the government. If you follow through, it's using fast action, which is a quick way to do, action alerts and making sure that things get out there quickly. So I share that with you. For those of you that want to support Jewish World Watch, again, that is just simply by going to jewishworldwatch.org. And I'm going to give you the donate link for any of you that care about supporting what we're doing. But without further ado, I do want to get this back to your previously scheduled lecture with Michael and just say how grateful I am for giving us the space to talk about this and know that there are things that you can do to make a difference in the world today. There are atrocities happening all over the world that no one wants to talk about. And these are the things that are happening beyond the headlines, under the headlines, or in rarefied headlines. And unfortunately, The numbers are great, and we would love your support, would love your help, and any input. So thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you very much, Jill, and I appreciate your efforts, and it makes some of us feel that that's precisely our responsibility. And I commend your efforts, and I commend the idea. If it hadn't been created, it should have been created, and that becomes pivotal. I want to go back and touch on a couple of things of the Armenian genocide. We're not going to have a chance to go into the Armenian genocide, but let's just give you a couple of elements and then answer several questions that have popped up. The Armenian genocide has several distinct elements. Number one, the Armenians were a Christian element in a Muslim world. The genocide and that was always a tense relationship. But again, within Islam, Christians and Jews had legal rights, albeit secondary rights as people of the book. And consequently, they were to be protected by Muslim law. What happened is essentially that with the Armenians was that a group of young Turks, they called themselves the Young Turks, took power. They had a radical agenda of making Turkey significant again and ending the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which was what one might call the ever-dying empire in the 19th and early 20th century. And for them, that meant the elimination of the Armenians. The Armenians were eliminated essentially first in the war zones. They were deported. There were a combination of elements of massacres that took place within the war zones. And then the Armenians were evacuated and deported and sent into the desert in conditions which led to their death, where there were no massacres or where there were significant massacres. And in the neighborhood of somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million Armenians were killed during this period of genocide. For us, there are three elements that are distinct about the Armenian genocide. Number one, it was not the total elimination of the Armenian people everywhere. Number one, that was not within the capacity of the Young Turks. Number two, the Armenians in Constantinople, contemporary Istanbul, remained relatively safe. And that is different, for example, than the final solution of the Jewish problem. And this is the origin of the words by Raphael Lemkin, in whole or in part. And very important to say, in whole or in part was meant to be inclusive, not exclusive. And one of the weaknesses, as we've seen over the years, is that there's no complete description of what he meant by in part, but it was meant to deal with the Armenian genocide. One of the reasons the Armenians were in Constantinople were not killed was the visibility of the Armenians in Constantinople and the availability of the Western world to see what was happening at that point. Many of the reports of the Armenian genocide that reached the West were originally the reports coming from missionaries who had been working with the Armenians. And in Constantinople, that would have called attention to it in a very dramatic way. And the last element I want, two more elements I want to point to. Number one is the enormous effort of Henry Morgenthau Sr., whose son played a pivotal role during the Holocaust when he was Secretary of the Treasury, confronted Franklin Delano Roosevelt on the inaction of the American government presented a, I want to say watered down, but that's not quite the way to describe it, a modified report that had reached his desk by three non-Jewish members of his staff, called on the acquiescence of the American government to the murder of the European Jews, reached Henry Morgenthau's desk. He brought a personal report to the president and then helped create the War Refugee Board, which ended up saving between 100 and 200,000 Jews in Europe in the years 1944 and 45. And at that point, Henry Mong, the image of his father, who courageously pressed for American action on the Armenian genocide, was pivotal. We also had a couple of other elements that are important. The Turkish government, the contemporary Turkish government since the end of World War I, has denied that it was a genocide and spent tremendous efforts to make sure that it was not classified as a genocide, even though there was no continuity between the Young Turks and the governments of Turkey, then essentially headed by Ataturk. But they did not confront it, and consequently, they never came to terms with it. And that led to an ongoing wound of the Armenian community, which means that they feel that their own suffering was not recognized and not presented. And they had an active program, and still have an active program, of denying that this is genocide, in part by saying it's not the Holocaust, since the Holocaust has been established, as it were, as the gold standard, or what I call the negative absolute of our society. Let me look for a moment at the questions and take them. We're asked again a very interesting question. How can we take care of others before we take care of ourselves? The statement that Jill was quoting is a statement in the Talmud, which is a very famous statement, Meina nili mili ukshani latzmi mani, vimlo achshave matai. If I am not for myself, who will be? But if I'm only for myself, what am I? If not now, when? That's a dialectic. Remember, one of the things that they do, even on the airplane, they say, before you help others, put on the mask yourself to keep yourself safe and able to help. Now, I'm asked by Ken to recommend a couple of books. Thank you. I don't know who briefed you on recommending a couple of books, but one of the books that I want to recommend is something called Blood and Soil by Ben Kiernan, A World History of Genocide and Extermination from Sparta to Darfur. And again, had the book not gone to press, he would have continued to update it. And it's a very important book. There's also a book by Sam Totten and Ben Kiernan on genocide and the like. That is highly recommended. I will put it in the chat. Stephen Weiss has asked me essentially a question that I struggled with throughout my career. What is unique about the Holocaust? I don't want to say in comparison, but as a distinct form of genocide. Let me talk about the origin of that, and let me just conclude with that. The question becomes, why is the Holocaust in particular to be remembered? And why? And is it merely that it's because the Jews have taken the trouble to remember it, or is there something very unique or distinct about the Holocaust? Let me suggest that there are several elements that are distinct about the Holocaust. I want to say scope, scale, magnitude, implications, methodology, and duration. The scope of the Holocaust was a something that evolved over 12 years systematically. The scale of it is that it essentially reached into 21 different countries. The duration of the killing was 4.5 years, with the worst of those years being the year that began in March of 1942 to the spring of 1943. And the best way to say it is when the Wannsee Conference took place. When the Wannsee Conference took place on January 20th, 1942, 80% of the Jews were still alive who were to be killed in the Holocaust. 15, 16 months later, 80% were dead. The worst year in Jewish history, in our entire history, is the year 1942. The element also is it involved two of the three great monotheistic religions of the world, Judaism and Christianity. It, in a lesser degree, involved Islam. And it also involved Western civilization because the way in which it was perpetrated, and normally people thought of genocide as a barbarian attack. This was far from a barbarian attack. This took place and was conducted by the most cultured, the most civilized, the most advanced, with the greatest science, with the greatest literature, with the greatest art, with the greatest music, with all of the elements of German culture, and involved all of the methodologies of Western civilization. And consequently, between monotheism and monotheistic religions and Western civilization, its implications has a tremendous duration, a tremendous impact on it. And finally, the methodology, which is it went from a personalized or relatively personalized, certainly radically different than Rwanda form of killing, to instrumentalities of death with a novum in history, which was a death camp that were death camp, and I can give it to you with apologies to Mark Twain, who said there are truth, lies, and statistics. Let me give it to you in statistics. The death camp of Belzec operated for 10 months in 1942, from March through December. The number killed at Belzec is approximately 500,000. The staff of Belzec was 104, of whom 14 were Germans. 90 were Ukrainians. Treblinka operated for 13.5 months, from July 1942 to August of 1943. The staff of Treblinka was essentially 120, of whom 30 were Germans. So the process of killing and the number of survivors of Belzec were 2. The number of survivors from Treblinka were less than 100, even though there was an active resistance there. And essentially, there was an organized escape, which is why we have survivors of Treblinka. And consequently, essentially 44 Germans could be responsible for the murder of somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.4 million Jews, because the Germans were assisted, the Nazis were assisted by their aides. And this created a novum, a factory of death. And the problem for all of us is whether the Holocaust becomes a precedent, whether the Holocaust becomes an aspiration, whether the Holocaust becomes a warning. And let me again say that is all the more reason to pay attention to other genocides as important, significant, and the like. And that's one of the purposes of our time together. So thank you very much for giving me what is most precious on your part, which is your time. It's unfortunate that we had an interrupted class that had to be missed. There was no choice about that. And thank you again for attending. Hope you'll attend some future courses as well.